Now, it's hard to believe that someone could be trained to sit in a room, zero in on a blind target, and come up with accurate information about something that is somewhere else in space and time. But we watched it for ourselves. It's called remote viewing, and the U.S. military spent $20 million to develop this mind-boggling technique.
Today I'm going to be sharing a story that seems almost too strange to be true. And even after decades of research, we still have no explanation for this phenomenon. The true story of remote viewing involves a top-secret military program researching psychic abilities and extrasensory perception. And the findings that came out of this program are so incredible that they challenge some of our most basic science about the universe that we live in.
For a number of years, CIA had been tracking Soviet work in the so-called ESP area. And they're really concerned because the Soviets, including the KGB, were spending millions of dollars every year on this kind of phenomena.
It was obvious to any intelligence organization that if you had an ability to be able to remotely perceive stuff, really remotely, like any place in the world, that could be an extraordinary intelligence source.
For more than 20 years, the CIA used psychic abilities operationally and in a top secret program for the US government. You paid for them, you deserve to see them.
They were experimenting and training people during the Cold War to be able to use consciousness to spy on the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union was doing the same thing.
So this was a serious scientific enterprise, even though what we're talking about are psychic abilities.
The sort of definition of remote viewing is the ability to perceive something that is distant or remote from you in distance, or it's blocked by a wall you can't see on the other side of the wall, or it's blocked by time, it's in the past or in the future.
What really caught my attention about this is the fact that the US government spent millions of dollars funding this program year after year for more than 2 decades. And this begs the question, why would the military continue spending millions of dollars on this program if it wasn't producing any compelling results?
I just happen to know that the US government doesn't put money in year after year after year for something that is not producing some kind of results. And that was the key for me. I really came at it from a left brain aspect.
The work we did at SRI involved things like finding a downed Russian airplane in North Africa with code books on it, locating a kidnapped American general in northern Italy, describing the construction of a huge Soviet submarine in northern Russia, and we even looked in on a Chinese atomic bomb test 3 days before it was scheduled to go off, and described correctly that it was going to fail.
Over the more than 20 years that Project Stargate was in operation, it produced an abundance of serious scientific research into extrasensory perception and human psychic abilities.
The first series of experiments here at Stanford Research Institute were what the scientists called remote viewing.
Many experiments have been done to demonstrate that this ability does in fact exist.
I just want to emphasize that at the time we were doing this work, this was mainstream, written up in the New York Times, published in the premier journals in the world.
According to mainstream science, psychic abilities don't exist and remote viewing should be impossible. But for anyone who actually looks at the research, undeniably there is a mountain of evidence from repeated scientific trials demonstrating that remote viewing is a real ability that cannot be explained simply by chance or coincidence.
The CIA was involved in the research, right, and other intelligence agencies within the US government.
That's right.
And they ended up using remote viewing for 15 to 20 years.
They did.
And so they obviously had enough faith in the efficacy of this or of the validity of this to pursue it. And you were providing the statistical analysis for that.
That's right. Any single incident could be explained away as coincidence or a lucky guess, but when you combine evidence, when you do controlled experiments using statistics, you can't explain things away as lucky guesses because we control the probability that things should happen just by chance. And so what I found was overwhelming statistical evidence, to 10 to a billion or whatever against chance.
The leading researchers for Project Stargate were these two physicists named Russell Targ and Hal Puthoff. And not only did they statistically validate the reality of psychic abilities, they took a further step and developed a systematic method for tapping into these psychic abilities that exist within each one of us and can be trained just like any other skill. And that's what remote viewing is.
Agents were trained in various ways of visualizing or remote viewing different targets. Sometimes they were given coordinates for a location, or pictures hidden in sealed envelopes. The task was to draw accurately what they could see only in their minds. How is it done? It seems to defy rational analysis.
I empty my mind and then I center my mind as well as I can. The information most of the time comes in many different fragments. It's usually very difficult to understand. You have to try to build a picture out of it.
The actual method for remote viewing is something I will discuss more in future videos, but the deeper you study this topic, the more bizarre it gets. Not only is it possible to remote view things distant in space, but also in time, in the past, or in the future.
All of the concepts of time and space or distance just don't apply.
The most interesting thing that we found as physicists is that it's no harder to describe what's happening in Soviet Siberia 6,000 miles away than it is for you to describe the funny object I have in my pocket.
But this is all just the tip of the iceberg. There are so many incredible stories around remote viewing that came out of Project Stargate. For example, Russell Targ used remote viewing to repeatedly predict accurate future financial forecasts and made a lot of money doing it. At one point, a man named Ingo Swann, who is a pioneer in this field and one of the most famous remote viewers of all time, used remote viewing to describe rings around Jupiter that scientists didn't know existed and only later confirmed when the Voyager satellite passed nearby the planet. But again, this isn't about a few lucky guesses. This is about decades of research and statistical proof way beyond anything that could be expected by chance. So now we have a situation where mainstream science insists that remote viewing is impossible, while at the same time all of the scientific evidence and research indicates otherwise. And we're at a point where we now need a new science of consciousness to accommodate these discoveries. And that's why I think that this is such an important topic.
Science may soon have no alternative but to grapple with the evidence that indicates that we truly are more than our physical bodies. Understanding the phenomenon of remote viewing is the key to all of this.
The evidence is telling us, the data is telling us, that there must be an aspect of consciousness that is not dependent on physiology.
So there are a number of theories. There's 7 basic theories. One of the most popular theories is that of quantum mechanics. The idea of non-locality, of quantum entanglement. It seems as though using this as an explanatory tool, the mind of the remote viewer is able to quantum entangle with the information.
He asked what's my best assessment of how this works. I'd say my best assessment is I don't have a clue. You can begin to match some of the data best if you consider multidimensional additional dimensions. But the future viewing really throws a monkey wrench into all of our present theories. But there are some models where if you have access to additional dimensions, sort of like you rise up out of space-time and you can look ahead and look behind.
The ability we're talking about is a natural psychic ability that we all have in spite of what you may have heard to the contrary. And this has been talked about for thousands of years. Buddhists have a vast lore about what this is and how to do it and why it's desirable.
Every single human being has the ability to do this. They just don't do anything to help develop it. So it's like you don't start out in kindergarten doing quantitative analysis and calculus. There's a process, right? It's the same thing with these capabilities.
After 20 years of work at SRI doing this activity for the CIA, and we spent more than $20 million, what we discovered is that the ancient Hindus, Patanjali, 500 years before Christ, had it right. Patanjali wrote a handbook describing how to get in touch with your psychic abilities on the path to transcendence.
The Yoga Sutras.
The Yoga Sutras. Of course, Patanjali said, you're not going to be interested in the fact that you can look into the future or look into the distance. That's just a stumbling block on the road to transcendence. But he felt that the aspirant should know that you will run into these paranormal abilities so that you shouldn't get attached to them.
So what do you think, guys? I'm so curious to hear your thoughts as always. Does remote viewing provide evidence that consciousness exists beyond the brain and beyond the physical body? Does it indicate that perhaps on a deeper level we are spiritual beings temporarily inhabiting this human lifetime, and that we are more deeply connected to each other and to the universe around us than we can perceive with our eyes? Personally, I do believe so.
But I think the true value of remote viewing is addressing that other issue. Finding out that you are actually more than your physical body, and finding out through your own experience.
The most important thing you can do with remote viewing is discover who you are. Now, it's important for me to tell you that remote viewing is not a spiritual path. But if you learn to quiet your mind and move your awareness into timeless awareness, you are likely to begin to experience things that surprise you, give you another view of reality.